Welcome to the pointy end. I'm Keith Sutherland. Today my guest is Ian Tulloch, well-known political commentator. Welcome, Ian.
Good morning, Keith.
Now, a lot has happened since last time we spoke earlier in the year. Politics was just kicking off with the year, of all of a sudden, bang. The last couple of weeks it's exploded. And firstly, we'll talk about that book, Nikki Sava's The Road to Ruin, where there's lots of criticism from Abbott and Peter Credlin, of course, in her involvement. And it's an amazing book where people are on record. I know that Tony Abbott and Peter Credlin came out a couple of days ago and said, well, they didn't ask us, but she said, well, they've always had an opportunity to have their say in the past. So this is her. Lots of people on the record and off the record have contributed to her book. So pretty explosive stuff.
Yeah, well, there's two things I'd like to say about this, Keith. I think it shows the fairly internecine disputes within the Liberal Party on a factional basis. Nikki Sava, perhaps on the moderate side, and Abbott and Credlin, of course, on the Conservative side. Sava's husband works for Turnbull, although yeah, that's probably not a factor here. But it also shows that Peter Credlin was a completely dominating and controlling Chief of Staff to Tony Abbott. He was quite dependent on her, and that's sort of a revealing behind-the-scenes stuff. I think intrigues people. But she takes credit for a lot of for the victory in 2013, for a whole range of Abbott's policies, as if they were as close.
They were running the country together, and yeah, and she also went on to say that without her, Abbott could not have done his job. So that's an indictment on Abbott, also on her, because they also credit her 2010 election campaign getting so close because Abbott was a very good opposition leader. There's no question about it. But the transition to be leader just never seemed to happen because he was still a head kicker. Yeah,
he's still in opposition mode. He didn't have a vision for the future, and that first budget in 2014 was disastrous for the government. Now, Credlin says that it was a coup by the Turnbull forces to take over from Abbott, but it wasn't. It was a result of a series of disastrous policy choices by the government and personal, and giving Prince Philip a knighthood, for example. I mean, these ideas were just quite crazy in retrospect. So it wasn't the coup, it was the fact that the Abbott government basically lost confidence of the party. So they just shifted to Turnbull. And
the bad polling, which really started from, well, he had 30 bad polls according to Malcolm Turnbull, but basically when the skirmish happened in February last year, and then till September, where they couldn't last any longer because they were just going nowhere. And of course, the polls changed dramatically. And when you and I discussed last time, it was 53-47. Now it's 50-50. So do you believe that that's correct when we've got News Limited, which is the most conservative of them, and Essential polls now putting them neck and neck at 50-50 each?
I think it's probably almost indicative of the public's mind. I think it's a little bit in favour of Labor at the moment. These polls, I think the realistic situation is that the coalition's still in front. But I mean, there's been two news polls, 50-50. Wait for the next one. If that confirms that, I think that's indicative, and it makes a double dissolution election quite tricky, I think, given that the polls have come back to being even, because 53-47, go to a double dissolution.
Yep.
You've got a great chance then of controlling the Senate. But when it's so close, and with the electoral reforms, which will be passed next week in the Senate, all the minor parties will be eliminated apart from Nick Xenophon, the Nick Xenophon group and the Greens. It's an unknown quantity at this stage.
I keep changing my mind because last time we spoke, I was convinced it was going to be July the 16th. I'm still convinced it's July. Then I changed my mind yesterday, thinking, I don't think they're going to go to a double dissolution. But then all the talk of bringing back the budget from the 10th of May to the 3rd of May, all of a sudden I'm thinking, well, you don't do that unless you can get the budget out there, have a bit of debate on the budget, and then you'll call the election, because the last day is the 11th of May to call a double dissolution. So it's got to be on. And the fact is that Turnbull's popularity is now dropping 4 points since the last poll. So he'd be getting nervous about his position as well. But as you said, it's pretty high risk stakes at this point in time.
Yeah, look, I did think it was going to be September, but now I've changed my mind, like a lot of people, and I think it will be on the 2nd of July. You bring the budget forward a week, you allow Bill Shorten as the opposition leader to give the budget reply speech on the Thursday, and then you go to see the Governor-General on the Friday, prorogue the Parliament and have a double dissolution, but a long election campaign, 7 weeks, and anything can happen in that time. And we very rarely have a winter election. Elections are usually later on in the year or early in the new year. There have been, I think the '84 election was in the middle of the year, but it's been a long time since there's been a mid-year election. And
school holidays are in between. Not that that has a bearing, but it does in a sense that people are thinking of other things rather than politics. And the thing is, Labor at the moment are way out in front with their policies, whether you like it or not. Negative gearing's out there, but there's no doubt in my mind. I heard Peter Dutton this morning talking about that a tax on housing. Also, rents are going to rise by 10%. So the slogans are coming out. Also, the scare campaign is coming out, which was typical Tony Abbott tactics.
But we've seen nothing about what's going to be in the budget either, in terms of tax reform. And I thought for a while there they would be quite strong on tax reform, but they've backed off pretty fast on that. So we might see a do-nothing budget that doesn't scare the horses and then go to a double dissolution election. But Labor's still in front, I think, in terms of taking the initiative on a whole series of policy initiatives, including tax.
Is that because, do you think, the Abbott faction is still really pulling the strings behind the scene, and Turnbull is too scared to make some decisions because for fear of offending these people? Because you look at Tony Abbott, just to make comment about him, the other day, instead of going from his 3-word slogan, he talked about restriction on negative gearing, a wealth tax, capital gains tax, bring it back from 50 to 25, seniors tax, talking about superannuation charges, workers tax, increased cigarettes, and carbon tax when we're talking about the emissions trading scheme. So this is Tony Abbott talking about policy, saying that he's what he achieved in those 2 years, he's trying to protect what he did in that period of time, whereas Turnbull's, he's seen to be do-nothing politician.
And I think he's backed off because of his desire not to have a fight with those right-wing Conservatives that were formerly Abbott supporters, some of whom actually voted for him. And he doesn't want to create an enormous internal fight in the lead up to the election. That's why I think he's backed off significant tax reform, because there's an enormous need for significant tax reform. There's so much middle class welfare entrenched in the system that someone's got to give it a go.
And Bill Shorten, for once, and I'm not a big fan of Bill Shorten as a leader. If they had another leader, I'm sure they'd be way in front. But having said that, it was interesting the other day that on Sunday morning on a program, George Brandis said, oh yeah, there'll be a plebiscite later this year, blah, blah, blah. They're going to spend $160 million on having the plebiscite. And then the next day, Turnbull saying, well, that's not the case. It'll be soon after the election. So they're really running scared about all those sorts of things, because the marriage equality bill, whenever that might be, is really going to be diabolical for the Liberal Party. And unfortunately, I guess that's why the Western Australian Senator, Bullock, pulled out, because he didn't want to be forced into, from 2017, Labor Party voting in favour of it. So there's a lot of issues, but Malcolm Turnbull just doesn't seem to be getting traction anywhere. And Bill Shorten is saying he waffles on all the time, and he does. He just waffles for the sake of hearing himself talk. So that's starting to have a bit of traction out there with the public, I would have thought.
Yeah, I thought George Brandis made a serious mistake here, because the Electoral Commission said it takes a long time to prepare the arguments both for and against the proposal when it goes up. That's why Turnbull intervened, because the Electoral Commission said you can't have it before next year. So there's not going to be a referendum.
It seemed to be a... Sorry.
There is a short circuit here, of course. What the Greens and the Labor Party want, just have a vote in the Parliament. It will save $160 million, get it over and done with, and settled as policy.
can they bring that forward to, I know it's only next week, so it's not going to happen now.
No, it's not going to happen.
So
if Labor wins the election, they'll bring it on.
Yeah, so it will happen after that, and then, yeah, there won't be $160 million wasted on the plebiscite, because you go to an election and you go and vote, and then if it was the plebiscite, if the Liberal Party is still in power at that point in time, there's no doubt that Corey Bernardi and others are not going to vote in favour of whatever the decision is made by the electorate.
Yeah, I think, but there's significant numbers of Liberal MPs that were opposed to it originally have changed their position.
Yeah.
I think the position in the Parliament now is it would get through relatively easily. But those people like Bernardi and his fellow travellers in the Liberal Party, they're determined to make this campaign a complete wreck to try and get the proposals voted down by the public.
I noticed that Morrison the other day was sort of saying something similar, because obviously he's anti-marriage equality. But there's another person that you mentioned, George Brandis, before, made the wrong decision on suggesting it on Sunday. The other one that's really making a lot of mistakes and not having any traction also is Scott Morrison as Treasurer. He just doesn't seem to be able to get out there with any policy of any sort. The tax debate, as you mentioned before, was something that the Liberal Party were going to be strong on. Well, they can't make a decision because they can't get to a point of what they want in, what they want out, because with negative gearing, Turnbull's virtually wiped that now. And all the commentators are saying from the Grattan Institute and beyond, it's a great idea, but he's sort of shot himself in the foot by saying, all right, we're going to oppose whatever Labor was suggesting. Where else are they going to get income from?
Well, see, Morrison's been caught in this trap by Turnbull not wishing to have a fight with the right wing over tax reform. And so Morrison's had to take a back room position here. He started off quite well, I thought, when he took over from Joe Hockey as Treasurer, but he's been very quiet of late.
Yeah, he just seems to have his wings clipped. And the other point, the final point I just want to talk about was the double dissolution, the changes to the legislation, because I read a WikiLeaks article last night about how the Greens have also seemed to have shot himself in the foot with a lot of supporters. A lot of the minor parties that were going to preference the Greens are now not going to preference the Greens. So is that going to have a voting effect? I know that it will go through, there's no doubt next week, the changes to the Senate voting. But is that going to affect the voting of the Greens when it comes to the next election? Because there's obviously going to lose two senators, South Australia, Western Australia, in double dissolution. But do you think their overall vote will drop down because of what they've suggested with this?
Well, not according to the news poll. It says their latest news poll says 12% for the Greens, which is above what they got at the last federal election in 2013.
But do the public understand this, though? Do you think?
I think Green voters do.
Yeah.
I mean, Green voters are an interesting demographic. Usually high-income professionals living in the inner suburbs of the major cities, younger people who have greater environmental consciousness, and students, of course. So those demographics are pretty strong, and they're not going to be. I think there's some in the Greens that think that this is going to be deleterious for them, and in the short term it will be. They'll lose a couple of senators, but it's a principled position they've taken, and I think Green voters understand that.
Well, Ian, as always, it's fascinating to talk to you, all your machinations of how it all comes together, how it's going to be, and no doubt over the next few months and next week we'll probably get a bit of an idea coming up to the budget, so I'm sure we're going to be talking more often about how it's all coming together. But now, last time I think we spoke that we didn't have the Liberal candidate, Megan Purcell, that Dennis interviewed, and she seems to be quite a capable person. I don't know how much time she's got because of farmer having to find a wife and other things. But anyway, a lot's happening on the local scene. But anything else that you know of that we should be listening to on the local scene?
Well, I think locally there was quite a huge swing against Labor in 2013. And Lisa Chester's nearly didn't win, but I think there'll be a normal correction, and I think there'll be a swing back to Labor in Bendigo, and the demographics favour Labor and the Greens, and the Green preferences flow 80% across to Labor. So if you've got those southern parts of the electorate in Castlemaine and down further south, a strong, a green stronghold, increasingly I think, and vast majority of those preferences flow to Labor. So I think the demographics favour the Labor Party, and I think there will be an automatic correction from the last election back towards Labor.
And she worked very hard down in that Kyneton area, yeah. Castlemaine.
And so I don't think Labor would be concerned at all about Bendigo.
All right, Ian, as I said, thank you for coming on the Pointing in the program this morning. It's great to listen to your observations of it all, and look forward to working with you coming up to the election.
Thanks very much, Keith.
Thank you.